A man was bitten by a dog. Later, after being rushed to the hospital, they realized that that dog was rabid. And at that time, in that place, this was an incurable disease. And so the doctor told the man, "You better get your affairs in order." The man, taken back, frustrated, asked for a piece of paper and began to write. And after an hour, he had been writing furiously. The doctor said, "Oh, I'm glad you took up my advice. That must be your will." And he said, "Will, nothing. This is a list of people I plan to bite." You know, people like this. It's been said that bitter people come in three kinds. You got the porcupines, those who have, good points, but they're hard to get close to. You've got the icebergs, where most everything going on negative is under the surface. And then you've got sort of the crybabies, and they're the ones that outwardly always wallowing in self-pity. And it's the kind of thing you see all over the place. What I'm about to mention to you really became much more clear when COVID hit and then on. But do you realize before 2020, the average number of FAA complaints about unruly passengers on planes was 143? That was the annual average. Last year, there were 915 of those in the first 5 months. Things seem to be going in a direction of more and more cantankerous, lack of contentment, bitterness, and resentment. And it's not just something that you see on planes. You can see it in lots of places. There's a cartoon I saw with a wife who was at a marriage counselor's office. And she says, "And do you know what he did on our honeymoon just 21 years ago?" The things we want to hang on to. In Hebrews chapter 12, beginning in verse 14, the writer says, "Strive for peace with everyone, and for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled." Colossians 3:19 says, "Husbands, love your wives and don't grow bitter toward them." Bitterness keeps God's people from experiencing all of God's blessings in their life, because in the place where we should be experiencing blessing, we simply project bitterness. And the Bible speaks to this issue. First of all, it speaks to where it starts. When you have bitterness, that's going to involve both seeds and soil. And the seed of bitterness is hurt. Everyone in this room has experienced hurt. This is not simply your story, it's our collective story. That's not the issue. The issue isn't, do you not know that I've been hurt? Yes. God himself knows what's going on in our lives. He experiences what we experience. When the text says that he bore our iniquities and our sorrows, and we saw him stricken of God and afflicted, more than just carrying our sin, we saw someone who identifies with our bruisings. There's all kinds of reasons why we experience hurt. But the text, Hebrews 12, points out how this starts. Look again at the passage. I want you to notice that while hurt may be the seed of bitterness, you need to have soil for that bitterness to take root. And the text says that the root of bitterness springs up in places where peace and holiness evacuated. Peace and holiness are the opposite of bitterness and resentment. A bitter person is one that harbors hostility and can't let it go. And once that root of bitterness begins, it festers. And we become the kind of people who just can't let it go in ourselves nor in those around us. Hypercritical people are almost always hurting, bitter people. The question is if we're willing to allow that hurt to be resolved. I do think it's possible. Just as Jesus said to the man who had been lame for all those decades, do you want to become well? It's possible to reach a point where we identify with our troubles so much that we think it's better to be bitter. The question is, are we going to change? We see how it starts. It starts when peace and holiness are no longer our goals, but rather bitterness becomes our identity. How does it grow? The text speaks to this. You know, the roots are underground most of the time. And the more you dig, the more you'll realize that root systems are quite complex. I've heard it said that in some places, some of these trees, if you were to stretch out the roots all the way out, it would go a linear mile. Think about that. When the text says, don't let a root of bitterness spring up, you're thinking about some little thorn. But what they're saying is a root of bitterness doesn't stop. It grows. And it begins to affect everyone and everything around it. I want you to think about the kind of grudges that we can carry for a long time. I want you to think about how we can harshly criticize other people. Think about how we often can even flatter other people as a way to try to care more about how people are going to feel than about what is true. And the fruit of bitterness, the text says, is explained right here in verse 15. It speaks to the trouble that happens in our lives. The text says, strive for peace with everyone and for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord, and see to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble in our lives. And then the text says, by it many become defiled. Oh, I see that many in two ways. One, speaking of all the people who are bitter. You know that bitterness ends up only hurting and destroying the one who owns it. And it will affect you in every possible way of your life. It'll be the reason why you have to go to the doctor, or to the psychiatrist, or to the morgue. Bitterness takes over. And I want you to see how the root system works. In Ephesians chapter 4, verses 26 through 31, the text gives sort of a linear list of ways in which the root of bitterness begins to be cantankerous and affect every area of our life. For example, you'll notice that bitterness, which is this inner smoldering sense, can lead to anger, which is this outward expression. And then anger leads to clamor, which is a sense of bad speech. And clamor leads to evil speaking, what particularly you say. But even all of this, which is bitterness and anger and clamor and evil speaking, can still be the kind of thing where at the end of it you say, I didn't mean nothing by it. So the text then adds malice. The root of bitterness leads to what we think, which leads to how we talk, which leads to what we ultimately want. And that can be when we really want to hurt somebody. On Sunday nights, beginning tonight, we're going to look at what's been called the 7 deadly sins. And I want you to know that the reason why we do sins is because there's something in it that's attractive to us. And in fact, in every of the major deadly sins, there's something that at the heart of it actually could be a good thing, but is taken to an extreme, except for one. Envy has nothing good in it. Envy is simply wanting wrong for the other. It's not that I wish I had what you've got, it's that I wish you didn't have. Who cares if I got it or not? I want you to have less. That makes me feel more. Bitterness leads to wrath, leads to anger, leads to clamor, leads to evil speaking, and then to malice. And the root of all this is bitterness. Now, please listen. When it says, by this many have become defiled, I want you to know that the many here is not just all those who are bitter. It affects everyone around you. Roots will not stay in your yard, as my neighbors have told me repeatedly. It always affects your neighbors as well. Misery loves company. One bitter person can destroy your agape group. One bitter person can ruin your marriage. One bitter person can negatively affect a church. It's been said that a rattlesnake, if it's cornered, can get so flustered it will bite itself. And that seems to be the case sometimes with us. We don't realize it, but it's true. Closely related to bitterness is resentment. And there's no word in the Bible for resentment, but the closest one to it, logizomai, is found, for example, in 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 5, where Paul is talking about love, and he says, love thinks no evil. The word there for thinks no evil is that it doesn't resent. It doesn't calculate and reckon wrongly. When God looked at the world and he reconciled the world and didn't keep a record of our wrongs, that means he didn't reckon and calculate against us. He bore no resentment. King David did. Remember that story in 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 5 through 6? David's on his deathbed. He's talking to Solomon. And if this was a movie, you'd have really beautiful music in the first part. David's laying on his deathbed, and he says to Solomon, I'm about to go the way of all the earth. I want you to walk in the way of the Lord. I want you to keep his statutes, and I want your children to keep the statutes. And then all of a sudden, the music changes, and it sounds like someone taking the marker off of the record player. He goes, oh, and by the way, remember Joab? That guy is the worst. I'll tell you what, whatever you do, make sure he doesn't go to his grave in peace. Here I am on my deathbed, and I'm trying to think good thoughts, but I can't let go of the fact that I can't stand Joab. Resentment. Why do we act this way? Why do we want to be this way? Well, it's because bitterness gives us neurotic pleasure, but it also gives us religious pride. There was a mother and a daughter talking to each other. And the mother said to her daughter, you know, so-and-so, I don't even answer the phone anymore when they call because I can't take on that baggage in my life. To which the daughter said, Mom, I appreciate that, but you're not exactly carry-on luggage yourself. Sometimes we have to speak the truth to each other. Bitterness is like drinking poison and thinking it's going to harm someone else, but it's also the case that bitterness and resentment often come from a failure to recognize that the thing we hate the most in someone else is a problem that we often have ourselves. And the thing we can't let go of is the very thing we beg God to remove from our own record. Oh, but we say, I have good reason. I have good reason why I'm harboring bitterness and resentment. You don't understand, is what you say. I'm not just talking about somebody who looked at me funny in the store. I'm talking about someone who abused a family member. I'm talking about somebody who betrayed their marital vows. I'm talking about someone who deceived their business partner and ruined their lives financially. Aren't those good reasons to hold on to hate? The text says no, they're not. And it's easy to misunderstand here because the easy move is to say, why don't we all just forgive and forget? The Lord tells us He knows that some hurts are so deep they can only be removed by death. And that's why He died in our place. Some wounds are so deep, the scars will remain, and that's why by His wounds we are healed. Some sin is so toxic, it must be judged. And He says, I will do that. But wouldn't it be great if there was a system by which all the sins will be judged, all the wrongs will be made right, and yet in the end, His children, His people, could end up sanitized from the consequences of it in such a way that you and I may escape the consequences of our own sin. And when we see the joy of that, the question is, are we willing to extend that same story to someone who's grieved us? I want to talk about what grace can do. How can we replace bitterness with blessing? And the first is to recognize it and expose it. You know, Zacchaeus, the wee little man, he's up in the tree when Jesus sees him and says, I'm coming to your house today, and that's all it took. The inward self-reflection, if my Lord is willing to sit at my table, it reminds me I need to do some introspection, and Zacchaeus says to Jesus, I've wronged. And whatever wrong I've done, I will make right again. In the presence of Jesus, you can't help but recognize the problem. But what about recognizing not just the problem that others have done to me, but the way in which I've allowed the results of that problem to stay in my life? I would encourage you, if you have the sermon notes, to write down why you're filled with resentment. Can you name it? Can you name the person? Can you name the event? Why are you full of bitterness? Can you name it? If we can recognize it, we can expose it, and we can find healing from it. Recognize and expose it. Second, be willing to cancel the debt. In Matthew chapter 18, there's a story in which Jesus is trying to explain how His kingdom is different than any other kingdom. And He says there was a man who owed the king a great debt. He couldn't pay it back in 10,000 lifetimes. But by pleading for mercy, the king says, fine, you're absolved. And on his way home, he sees a fellow member of his own group who owes him much smaller amount in comparison. And the man asks for the same amount of mercy, but he can't give it. He can't give it because even though he's been forgiven much, he hasn't been able to pass that along because the debt I owe has been canceled, but the debt you owe, that's still on the books. He wouldn't do it. And the king finds out about it and throws him in prison until he pays the last bit. And the text says, so shall our Heavenly Father do if we can't forgive from the heart. We're called to be different, to cancel the debt, to let it go. There's a story. Two monks are walking a long distance. And while they're on the way, They see a woman, a frail woman, who says, I need help. I can't walk. Would one of you please carry me? So they both join in carrying her, and they carry her a good long way before she gets to where she needs to be. They let her go, and as they keep walking, one of the monks turns to the other and says, I can't believe she made us do that. That was very, very frustrating. Another mile down the road, he says, you know what? My back is getting stiff. I bet it was all that lady's fault. Another mile down the road, he says, you know what? I can't walk anymore. My back is so thrown out because of all this. I'm so frustrated, and sits down. And the first monk smiles and says, can I tell you why your back is hurting? It's because you're still carrying that woman. I put her down 5 miles ago. Think about what we do when we allow the bitterness, the hatred, the resentment to ruin our lives. And while we're harboring all of that, they're dancing in the streets. It makes no difference to them, but it ruins you. Can we cancel the debt? Can we move from forgiveness to mercy to grace? I know it sounds like I'm saying the hurt isn't that bad. No, I'm saying the grace that replaces it is that good. Bob Goff writes some excellent stories. I hope that half of them are true. Bob says that there was one time when he wrote a letter to his daughter on the day she was born. He wrote the letter, he put it in a bottle, and then he dug a hole in his backyard and he buried it. 17 years later, his daughter is driving a car and she gets in a car wreck. She's driving her dad's car and gets in a wreck. She's so upset. She feels awful, and she's trying to tell her dad, Bob Goff, that she wrecked the family car. And Bob said, I want you to do something. He texted the coordinates. Said, I want you to go dig this up. Probably thinking, so this is what I do when I wreck a car. I have to go dig a hole. I saw Cool Hand Luke. This isn't going to end well. So she gets the shovel. She digs up the hole. She picks up the bottle. Inside the bottle's a letter written 17 years ago in which Bob Goff said, I forgive you for wrecking the car. And he says, I predetermined to forgive that which I assumed might happen. I wonder if there were 25 letters of 25 different things that might happen. But I planned a long time ago to be a person of forgiveness. Removing the hostility opens the way for grace. And when you add grace, you heap blessings on someone's life. And maybe that's why the only part of the Lord's Prayer that is repeated is the part about forgiveness. Expose the problem. Be willing to cancel the debt, and then in its place, all you're left with, if you get rid of the bitter roots, you still have a wound. Allow grace to grow in its place. Listen again to Hebrews 12. Strive for peace with everyone, and for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God. When you forgive, you set two people free. One of them is yourself. It's possible to live in such a way that you don't let your wound become your identity. And that's why in Ephesians 4 and in verse 31, the text says, let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice. Be kind to one another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another as God in Christ forgave you. Many of you have heard the story of Corrie Ten Boom. Maybe you remember that she was a prisoner, and she was a prisoner at Ravensbrück, the same place where her sister died in that very prison. She remembered having to walk back and forth naked and afraid in front of the guards, watching her sister die. Her father died in a different concentration camp. And when she got out of that Nazi prison, she determined that she was going to travel all over Germany. And her main mission for the rest of her life was going to be to preach Christ's forgiveness. And so she went preaching forgiveness everywhere she went. And in 1947, she said one Sunday morning she was in Munich, and a man came forward to greet her, and she recognized him immediately. She remembered his face. It was one of the prison guards. She had been preaching about God's forgiveness when one of the former guards looks at her and says, "Fraulein, it's wonderful. It's wonderful that Jesus forgives all of our sins, just as you said. You mentioned Ravensbrück. I was a guard there. And since then, I've become a Christian. I know that God has forgiven me, but it would do my heart good to hear it from you as well. Fraulein, will you forgive me?" And Corrie Ten Boom said that she was paralyzed. She didn't want to do it. She had been preaching this message, but she couldn't do it herself. She had been humiliated. She saw her sister die at this man's hands. And she said, at the same time, I felt so ashamed that I couldn't get the words out. She said, I could barely do it, but I don't know where I got the power from, but I was able to at least lift my hand. And she said, when I lifted my hand, I felt the strongest sense of power stretching from my shoulder down to my elbow, all the way out to my hand, at which I was able to shake his hand. And then I was able to say the words, I forgive you. And Corrie Ten Boom says, I felt the burden lift off of me. And in that moment, I was set free. God's given us an incredible antidote to bitterness and resentment. It's grace. He's not asking us to sweep the problems under the rug. He's asking us to douse the flame of bitterness with the peace of Christ. He's not asking us to simply remove a problem and go around with a gaping wound. He wants to heal our hearts with His grace. And His grace grows even deeper, even faster than the root of bitterness. Do you realize where sin abounds, grace much more abounds? And do you realize that when He came to set us free, He brought redemption as far as the curse is found? That even includes your heart if you'll open it to Him. Thank you for joining us. I hope you've been encouraged. I hope you've been enriched. And if you have any questions, any thoughts, any comments, reach out to us at prayers@wschurch.net. God bless you. Tune in next week.